And maybe the most powerful is I call it the paradox, or simplifying that is how do you give your pain purpose? Because the human ego doesn't experience or doesn't understand how I could benefit from a challenging event. So if you ask a client or somebody a paradoxical question from that challenging life experience, what was the main lesson that you learned?
Welcome to Mother Nature's Doctor, the podcast where ancient wisdom meets modern wellness. Hosted by Dr. April Schulte, a specialist in Chinese medicine, this show explores the power of nature as the ultimate healer. Each week, Dr. Schulte dives into a new health topic, revealing how holistic practices, herbal medicine, and time-tested natural remedies can help you live a healthier, more balanced life. Get ready to nourish your body, calm your mind, and reconnect with the wisdom of Mother Nature.
Welcome to Mother Nature's Doctor. I am Dr. April Schulte, and I'm so happy to have a very special guest with me this evening for our podcast, and also happy to have you, the listener. So I can promise this one will be extra entertaining. And how I know that is because I have yet to have a single dull conversation with the one and only Michael Palmer. Michael Palmer is a holistic coach with over 20 years of experience now, addressing the root cause of dis-ease through the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and intuitive aspects of life. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Intuitive aspects of life. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think that the intuition, if we define intuition as my ability to trust self, I actually think that's the most overlooked thing in holistic health. So in holistic health, you always hear physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, but never intuitive. But a lot of people have a hard time trusting themselves, so they always look external for answers.
It's almost cliche, the mind, body, spirit.
Exactly.
And we think a lot about the five senses, right? But intuition can be considered the sixth sense.
Right. The sixth sense, and, similar to the conversation we'll have today, is the ego doesn't get the sixth sense. So we seek the answers outside of us constantly when, in my opinion, we have all the answers we need. They just need to be tapped into.
I first met you as one of your clients, and then since then we've shared clients together. And this whole issue of ego comes up pretty readily with you. And that's when I get the deer in the headlights look. And I think it's important to talk about what is the ego and how does that play into your work?
Yeah, for me, the human ego is how we identify ourselves. And I think a great question to always ask a client is, what's the difference between who you think you are and who you actually are? That also elicits the deer in the headlight response, but it's an interesting question, especially if it's answered, because the answer, if you take away who you think you are, you'll soon discover that you're still there, even if that thing isn't there.
Right.
So I'm a mom. Okay, but if you weren't a mom, you're still here. I'm a coach. I'm a acupuncturist. But if I wasn't a coach and you weren't an acupuncturist, we're still here. So by definition, we're not those things we identify as ourselves.
There's a common thread I see along the lines of the work I do with my clients, which is the idea of having self-value. How do we value ourselves? And a lot of our values that we place on ourselves do have to do with labels. I'm an acupuncturist. I'm a mom.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a dad. I'm an electrician, And so when we do strip away what it is that we do, we are left with ourself, our true self. And often we're just not asked what that means, or how do we even start to look at that?
Yeah, and trying to keep it simple. So I break the ego down into 3 parts. So I say the ego is really developed from age 0 to 12. A lot of that has to do with the brainwave state that we're in during that age. And then to keep it simple, I have a mother ego, a feminine energy, or how I experienced mom from age 0 to 12, not who she was, but how I experienced her and the stories I made up about her. Father ego, masculine energy, how I experienced my dad. Not who he is. I'm not going to know who the guy is, but the stories I made up about him. And then child ego, how I experienced my childhood from age 0 to 12, predominates that identity of who I think I am. And then how that carries off into my behaviors, my reactions, my triggers, disease in the body, symptoms in the body. So it's how I judge life, essentially.
I like how you brought up that it's how we perceive or what was our experience with our parents, with the feminine, the mom, the masculine, the dad.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily how they were, but how we perceive them or how we experience them as a child. And I'm going to guess that how we experience ourselves as children impacts how we experience our parents. And then the stories we make up are pretty impactful.
Yeah, I probably should add. So in those realms, from my understanding, is the subconscious mind is a little more powerful than the conscious mind. Some would say 95% more powerful, and that subconscious programming is really set in stone between ages 0, 7, 0, 12. And then how we experienced those three, mother, father, child, it kind of makes up how we experience the rest of our life into early adulthood. And the work that I do is kind of dissecting that program from the earlier age and then connecting the patterns of how it's playing itself out into adulthood.
As a holistic coach, what are some of the most common chief complaints you see from your clients?
A lot of people come to me with body pain. Or they want to change how their body looks, or they have specific diseases. So if we, very commonly body pain. So somebody comes to me and they have a hurt shoulder. So it's a literal statement. My shoulder hurts. And most people or most practitioners are going to address, okay, that part of the body, shoulder.
Right.
What I want to know is what does that shoulder pain mean to you? I want to metaphorically know what that means to you.
Let's take this example and run with it.
What?
Because from an acupuncture standpoint, we might think about the meridians that pass through the shoulder. And we certainly start to begin to understand that the shoulder is not just the shoulder. It is impacted not even by areas close to the shoulder like your wrist or your neck, but even could be related to the opposite foot. And maybe we're supinating or pronating. So we can look at it strictly from a musculoskeletal perspective. We also would think about how healthy is the tissue, how healthy is the joint itself. So we start breaking that down into its parts, which we love to do that in Western thinking. Let's just break down everything down into its parts.
Right.
What's interesting about this conversation is you're bringing in a whole different meaning, because certainly we can recognize, or at least a lot of us now can recognize, that our emotions even get trapped in the tissue. And you're taking even one step further than that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. Is my whole premises is the elephant in the room is the emotional component of those 5 things. So it's easier to address my physical shoulder than what it emotionally might mean to me. So that's why I call it the elephant in the room. Is we're more likely to address the physical aspect of that. But what I've seen in 20 years of practice is there's always an emotional component to the injury, body part, disease, weight gain, anxiety, depression, whatever the symptom might be.
Mm-hmm. Because the same root of a problem, the elephant in the room, so to speak, can cause myriad of different symptoms.
Yeah, I think that's why you and I have that's where we have commonality me as a coach, you as an acupuncturist, is I believe that the energy is stuck in the body.
Absolutely. And there's so many different ways that we can move it because we are energy.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the way that I work with it is I have a 4-step progress with it, which is the literal, the metaphoric, the paradoxical, and then the creative realms that I call the 4 steps of healing. Literal is pretty straightforward, and I'm sure you're aware of it as well. When people come in and tell you their symptoms, they fill out their chart. What's going on? And then that's an important part. But from my experience, is most people get stuck in the literal. They get attached to their literal story about shoulder pain or weight gain, and then they don't dig deep enough to move the energy long term because they just stay with their story.
Right. There's lots of ways that when we do stay with our story, we stay at that first level, that we can at least temporarily move the energy. I'm
Hmm.
going to exercise. I'm going to get acupuncture. I'm going to see the chiropractor. I'm going to put some ice on it. Which all of those are helpful tools along the way, because you might be in excruciating pain.
Yeah, 1,000%. And I think that, we have commonality too, is we commonly see the client come back. So that temporary relief, they're good for a little while, and then lo and behold, they come back to us and they're like, oh, it's back. And then for me, that's kind of when we're like opening up possibilities of maybe it's not just physical.
So the next level, level 2, is what?
It's what I call the metaphoric. So discovering like what this injury, disease, or symptom means to you. Okay. And so why we move from the literal to the metaphor is we're trying to get the human ego to start to detach away from its story. Because from my experience, the more attached the ego is to its story, the less likely the person is going to heal.
So here you are bringing up ego again. It's always my favorite part of every talk we have about the ego. Before I ask you more about what the ego actually is, how did the ego hook you into your work?
Well, I mean, I think I journeyed along that same realm. Is in my early 20s, when I was only addressing the physical, I had a lot of symptoms as well. So I had multiple surgeries, and then lo and behold, after those surgeries, 3 months, usually on the dot, I would develop like extreme anxiety. And I'd be like, well, I felt normal on Thursday, but I don't feel normal on Friday. And it would subside itself. But when I was 25, I had an ACL surgery. 3 months later, had extreme anxiety. And then I started to like dive into gut health and how the gut was connected to the brain. And that really pushed me towards kind of the outside thinking of just the physicals. It then led me to therapy for myself. And then when I started to address the emotional components of what this anxiety might mean to me, I noticed that I was getting long-term relief from the anxiety rather than short-term relief.
And then in that work, presumably you started to learn about the ego itself.
Yeah, yeah.
And what did you learn? What is the ego? It gets a bad rap, the ego, these days. A lot of us are told, hey, let the ego go.
Mm.
But I know it serves a purpose.
Yeah. It's always a trigger for me, is when I hear like death to the ego or getting away from the ego. I always tell people to run from people that say that, because the ego actually does serve a purpose in this literal realm. It's how we navigate. It's how, like, I drove to your office today to record this podcast. I had to judge what road to turn on, what light to turn on. And so it serves a purpose. Like, there's a functionality to the ego, but there's also a big dysfunctional component to the ego, is to understand that maybe there's something bigger going on than my five senses, or maybe there's something bigger going on than just this literal realm. And once I started to play with how the ego creates stories and attaches to the story, and that's what really causes the symptom to hold. And then I was invited to start to question my own stories. I noticed some significant transformation occur.
So as I'm understanding this conversation, at least right now, is that the ego can keep us trapped in the literal realm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so while the literal realm has its purpose and the ego serves us in the literal realm, for us to progress and move forward in our healing, then it helps us to understand the story we've developed that our ego kind of helped us create, or at least hold on to the story. But to move forward, we want to learn to let go of that story as the ego tries to hold on to it.
Yes, yes. And so I always try my best. It's not a simple concept, right? But
Why not?
I try my best to simplify it. Is what gives the ego all of its power is predictability and familiarity. So if there was a pattern that happened in your past, the ego attaches to the familiar or the predictable pattern, and then it plays itself out into the future. And then so challenges you had in your childhood inevitably will be challenges you have in your adulthood until you start to dissect what the ego is gaining power through from previous life experiences.
That's helpful. So then the third stage?
So the third stage, in my opinion, is, and maybe the most powerful, is I call it the paradox, or simplifying that is how do you give your pain purpose? Because the human ego doesn't experience or doesn't understand how I could benefit from a challenging event. So if you ask a client or somebody a paradoxical question from that challenging life experience, what was the main lesson that you learned? It confuses the human ego, because the ego is associating that with a negative experience, but you're asking it to give it a positive reframe.
Right.
Once you reframe it positively, things appear to change.
And at that point, would you expect your client's chief complaint to change at that point, maybe? Or do we need to wait till the fourth level?
No. So in all honesty, the change occurs in the metaphor,
Okay.
okay? Because that's your first step of saying, I'm going to give this a different story than I've given it the previous 10,000 times. So instead of my shoulder hurts, I can't move it, you could ask the person, who's driving you crazy? Who's a pain in your neck? How much weight are you carrying on your shoulders?
Right.
Where would you guess you carry the most weight in your life? And that if they can answer that question, change has already occurred, because now they're not attached to that literal story anymore.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So between the metaphor and the paradoxical levels, immense change will occur, because the human ego can only attach to one thing at a time. So you're dividing the story into 2, 3, 4 new possibilities that have never been considered before.
So it's already diffusing
Yeah.
the story,
Yeah.
therefore it's diffusing the pain.
Yeah. So if you took a client and they told you their literal story and you brought them to the metaphor, what did it mean to you? You brought them up one level to the paradox. What did you learn from that painful life lesson? Now you got like 5 stories. Okay. And so the ego could never retell the literal story the same way. They could try, but they're not going to be able to tell it the same way. So change has already occurred.
That's the beautiful thing.
Yeah.
So one thing I've noticed a lot in my career is I might suggest to a client that it would be helpful to maybe go speak with someone like yourself about the power of understanding how our emotions are in our body. And that I think that asks the person to take some responsibility too for the idea that, okay, it's not just my little story in the literal realm. And that alone challenges the ego. And that's why they love to say to me, I should be able to do it on my own. Why would I need to go see a holistic coach or a counselor when I should just be able to do it on my own?
So the ego is incredibly powerful. Okay. So it again, it's so attached to what was familiar, what was predictable. From my standpoint, is that's why we don't change. And why we don't change is because at that juncture, the subconscious programming is really running the show. So I should be able to do this on my own. But if I was to do it on my own and I was to change, that is a new experience that the ego hasn't experienced before. So I use the word lightly with you, double bind. Okay. And we're still working
On understanding what is double bind.
right.
What does that even mean? What is a double bind? So much for keeping this simple.
I know, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Um, we can simplify it even more if you want. Um, so people come to you because they want to change, right? They want to get healthier. They come to me because they want to get healthier. Okay. So one of the main questions I ask clients is, how do you benefit from your disease? Because right there, it automatically confuses the ego. Because it's like, oh, I don't benefit from this, and this, or I don't benefit from my shoulder pain, or I don't benefit from my weight gain. Yeah, you do. You do. Okay. So if it's true that children equate attention to love and vice versa, then usually people benefit from their diseases because it's a form of attention. It's how I pay attention to self.
This is worth really taking a moment to pause and talk about just that concept alone, about how as children we equate attention with love. We don't really understand that love might be different than attention when we're a toddler or a baby.
Exactly. So I have kids and you have kids. The child doesn't run around the house saying, "Mommy, Daddy, love me, love me." They run around the house and say, "Mommy, Daddy, look at me, watch this." So it's learned and programmed at an incredibly early age that attention equals love. Okay. So if I don't get attention through the external source, it's possible I create a challenge in my life as a form of paying attention to self. Hard concept to swallow.
Can you reframe it?
Mm,
Try to put an actual symptom to that. Like, let's say someone has headaches or
mhm.
anxiety, common things that we see. How would the idea of not paying attention to ourselves, even maybe we don't pay attention to ourselves when we're older based on the fact we didn't get attention as kids and therefore we don't understand what love is? Can we take it that far out?
Mm-hmm.
And then our story then becomes like back to the literal with other symptoms like headaches or anxiety or shoulder pain.
So yeah, so let's take headache for example. So you have a headache and mm, let's say for example like you're in a relationship and that person in your relationship's not paying attention to you. From my point of view, the human ego is so strong that it will create a symptom like a headache in order to be paid attention to, even though it's not a joyful or pleasurable experience.
And then
It,
therefore they are benefiting from their headache
it,
because they're getting attention.
right. It's kind of a last ditch effort. Is it's a way of paying attention to self, because to the human ego, if nobody pays attention to me, I don't exist. And that's far more threatening to the human ego than a headache is, or any disease is.
So what is the fourth level?
The fourth level is the creative realm, which is to understand, at least on some level, you created all of your life experiences. So it's the realm where you're essentially taking 100% responsibility for your life experience. And that's very scary to parts of self, and it's also very liberating to other parts of self.
Right, because it gives us the power to create our lives.
That's right. Okay, you're not held captive by what somebody did to you at 5 years old. You give it a different meaning, and you learn certain things from that lesson, and I call it taking your power back. So you move from a helpless state or a disempowered state to an empowered state now. And then again, some people are able to go to that fourth level and some people aren't.
When we feel trapped in any way, maybe we feel trapped, literally trapped in a space, or we feel trapped in our own belief systems, then in Chinese medicine, we would say that the qi or the energy becomes stuck.
Right.
And often we will blame that on the liver in Chinese medicine. The liver courses the qi throughout the body. We want at all times for the qi to be moving freely because that's when we feel good. Sort of like being stuck on a freeway in traffic and not being able to move. I don't know anyone who's happy in that situation.
Right.
And when the body's experiencing that, we call that liver chi stagnation. The energy's stuck. And when we start to tie together these different ways of thinking about it, it really is empowering, because when we are able to let go of those stories and understand how the ego plays a part of this and how the ego does like to hold on to that literal realm, and then we experience freedom, that's where we truly have the opportunity for healing in my eyes.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Is mm, you know, we're our own worst enemy. We just don't realize we're our worst enemy. So the ego is more apt to blame or project on an external source than to look at self and how I created this dilemma or challenge.
I would not have been able to host this podcast a year ago, because it has taken me this long working with you as a client to start to understand where you're coming from and what you try to teach your clients about the ego. And I'm me. So I've had 21 years of professional practice experience, and therefore I already have a pretty clear understanding of how the emotions affect our health and how the spiritual affects our health, and to recognize the power of our intuition. And so, when for our listeners, what are some encouraging words you could provide in case this conversation feels a little overwhelming?
Yeah. I guess it's it's not as hard as it seems. It's not. So I mean, when we have life challenges, we think that we have to do all these things, but it's much simpler than, again, our ego creates it to be.
I would like to encourage anyone who can relate to this on any level to find someone such as yourself who can start to look at this. Are there any other resources that you can think of that people can turn to if they're not quite ready to pick up the phone?
Yeah, I think she's based out of Phoenix. She has an incredibly large following. Um, she calls herself the holistic psychologist. Million
Oh,
people follow her.
yeah.
Yeah, and her and I have very similar ideologies. She does a really good job of simplifying it, and then she has workbooks that you can buy and kind of fill out yourself. And then she has other resources that are a much more simpler format.
And if they are ready to pick up the phone, as they say, I would like to encourage our listeners to reach out to you at mikepalmercoaching.com. And do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share as we wrap up this issue of our podcast? Because I'm expecting us to do plenty more.
I hope so as well. I think just to maybe stay open-minded, that there's more going on than just my literal symptom or my literal story, and that maybe my healing and freedom could come if I just open my mind to bigger possibilities that I might not be aware of yet.
That's so well put. Just to be curious
Curious.
about other
Yeah.
possibilities.
Yeah, I always say curiosity is the gateway to healing.
I couldn't think of a better note to end this podcast on. Thank you so much for joining me for this issue of Mother Nature's Doctor podcast. We'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks.